Hi, and welcome to the first legislative update of the 2025 session from Child Care Aware of Minnesota. My name is Ann McCully, and I will be posting these short video updates each Tuesday with activity from the legislative session from the previous week up through Friday. We will do our best to stay on top of anything that has moved forward in early childhood, child care, or school age care. That includes action on the floor, action in committees, and later any activities around conference committee negotiations. If you want more information about bills that have been introduced, there's also a weekly bill tracker that we post. So all the bills that have been introduced, whether they've had hearings or not, you can find there, and then also a link to read those bills. A little bit of context just to remind folks, this is the beginning of a 2-year biennium, so a 2-year session, and we've had an election on the House side, and so many members are new, and typically in the first few weeks of a legislative session, certainly in the first couple of weeks, a lot of the focus is on getting people oriented to their role, getting people into committees and becoming familiar with those committees, and so not a lot to report generally in the first couple of weeks. On the Senate side here in Minnesota, there was only one Senate election, and that continued the balance of power up through the start, right before the start of session. So on the Senate side, we had one seat majority on the Democratic side. Unfortunately, we had the loss of Senator Carrie Dietzich just before the session convened, and that will have a special election coming up on January 28th. So that did tip the Senate temporarily into a tie, but the Senate was able to create a power sharing agreement, meaning that they have co-chairs for all of the committees. They're taking turns convening the committees, and pending the outcome of the January 28th election when the majority will be decided. We continue with the same Governor Walz, and with the same cabinet officers. So really the changes are primarily in the House. And as many of you have heard, there was a very what word does one interesting start to the House side of things on January 14th, primarily stemming from the fact that once again, before session started, we had a tie in the House. So we had 67 seats that were for Republicans and 67 seats won by Democrats. And in the run-up to the start of session, one of the Democrats was found not to, or accused of not having residency, and he stepped down. And so there's one open seat yet to be determined when that special election will take place, but it led to a disagreement between the parties over what constitutes a quorum. And that was resolved last Friday through the intervening of the Minnesota Supreme Court. Basically, the Republicans have advocated that since they have a one-seat temporary majority with an open seat, that open seat shouldn't count, and they have a quorum. The Democrats said no, it needs to be 68 seats, and indeed that is what the Supreme Court ruled. So back to the drawing board for the House. No action on any of our bills were taken in the last 2 weeks in the House, although they were meeting as Republicans and holding committee hearings. But again, a lot of that was walkthrough. So I'm sure certainly we will learn more in the next couple of weeks about what's to take place. The last player in all of this, of course, is once again the governor. And you can find an update on the governor's budget proposal, which came out on January 16th, posted on our website. And that's a good example of one more thing I'll make sure you know, and that is that we will, through key times during the legislative session, we will post written updates that give you more information than I can cover in my 7 minutes or so on here. So with that, the only action taken last week in the House or Senate was in the Senate Tax Committee, where there was a bill heard that's been introduced, and Senator Weber introduced Senate File 339. That is a bill that would grant licensed family child care providers a credit against their property tax. So if they owe property tax, 50% of that would be forgiven, and or rather, I should say, replaced by a credit, and that would be covered by the state. So this was met with a great deal of support in the committee, bipartisan support. In fact, several members said that first of all, why didn't I think of that before? And asked if they could co-author the bill. So met very favorably and was laid over for consideration, which is a term, if you're new to us, you will learn. That basically means it will be one of many things that the Senate Tax Committee will take back up when it's time to put together their omnibus bill. And so that's all we have from last week in terms of action on a child care or early education bill. Uh, as far as other upcoming events in the coming week or two, all of the House committee hearings that were scheduled have been canceled while the House works out what's going to be next. In the Senate, there are primarily continued walkthroughs and overviews, a little bit of delving into the governor's budget, but no bills as of right now have been scheduled for a hearing related to our issues. Probably the biggest thing to be on the lookout for is the budget forecast. That's called the February forecast. So will take place in February. That's not always the case with the November forecast. That's usually in December, go figure. But the February forecast is in February. I do not have the date for that yet, but we will include that in our next update if we know. That really is the next sort of finer point analysis of what the state has to spend, what the projections are, and that tends to guide the legislators in terms of what they put forward for their budget proposals. It guides the legislature overall on what they call targets, which is how much each committee can spend, etc. So all with this goal of by the end of the year, by the end of the legislative session, I should say, having a budget decided. So lots to come. And thank you very much for joining us. And be sure to tune in and send us any information you feel that we need to be including if we are not. Last thing I'll say is we will post in the notes a link to a very helpful resource, which is the Minnesota House Session Daily. Particularly in this last week, there have been a couple of articles about this impasse and the ruling in the Minnesota Supreme Court that you may want to read for more detail and context. But any week, that's a very helpful tool in terms of recapping what's gone on. So don't make me your only source. Be sure to read Session Daily. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.